Welcome, everyone. My name is Shirin Khosropour. I'm a psychology professor at ACC, and I'm director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at Austin Community College. But I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Mark Cunningham, who will introduce himself and then turn it over to Anne.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Mark Cunningham. I'm a professor in the radio, television, and film department at Austin Community College. I teach courses in intro to radio, television, and film, intro to cinema, and media literacy. I'm going to turn it over to our discussant today, Anne Lewis. So Anne, if you could tell us something about yourself, it'd be great.
Sure. Right now, what I'm doing is teaching at UT Austin. I teach mainly film editing, and I teach it at upper division level. So one of the things that I was asked to do is talk a little bit about education and my understanding of the ACC. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful way to do lower division. Some of my best students are out of the community college system, and my own kid went 2 years to ACC, moved on to UT, and has a master's now in social work. So I think it's a wonderful way to get an education. Personally, I got my degree when I was 50 years old. So, just know that it is not something that people always go straight through. All kinds of things happen along the way, like children and moves and relationships and making films and all kinds of things. So I'm still also making films. My favorite film is the one that I did last, or that I'm working on now. But my latest one is about Raul Las Salinas, who is a local poet. It's all about East Austin. It's a kind of a jazz experimental documentary, and I'm sure we'll show it a lot around town. So that's with me and Laura Varela working as directors together. Harlan County was something that I did when I was about your age. While it's not my film, it's Barbara Kopple's film, there is no film that belongs to one person. We're always working in teams. So it's a very important kind of thing for us to acknowledge all the people that work on any film. So on Harlan County, I was the associate director and assistant camera person, and our crew was at most 4 people, sometimes 3 people. You're talking about very directly involved. In fact, I have a little cameo in the film. Looked very different then.
Oh, that's awesome. Hopefully everyone had a chance to see Harlan County prior to this discussion. And if not, I strongly urge you after this to please check this film out. I think it is one of the most important films ever made. And I think it's one of the best documentaries ever made, honestly. It is a moving piece of work and about how the system works against certain people, but how those people come together, right, to assert themselves and to demand their rights. And it's one of the most important things we can do, I think, as citizens in this country. Just to start off, Anne, I'd like to ask you, what do you believe the role of documentary filmmaking to be as it pertains to like chronicling historical events, influencing us as a culture?
Yeah, I think it's interesting how few labor struggles have been documented. That really concerns me, or have been documented and then achieve the kind of distribution and fame that Harlan County has. There's a book by Tom Zanielli. The title ends with riffraff, but one of the points he makes is that most of the films about labor have been made by women, which is really interesting. This kind of people's history, the historical chronicling or documentaries about perceptions of history or events has been very limited, away from a kind of a people's history. It's been much more what goes on with, important people making decisions about things rather than the collective force of people down at the bottom of the economic ladder. Personally, I think that's all that's important. That's who makes change in this country. That's who should be making change in this country, at least. So for me, that's a terrible absence. And I hate that Ken Burns is all by himself being public television these days, chronicling war from a very arrogant level, I think. I don't like Ken Burns, and I'm not the only person that doesn't like Ken Burns.
I've heard some things myself too.
There's a very good essay by Eric Foner at the end of Who Owns History, which just blasts Ken Burns' coverage of the aftermath of the Civil War.
It's really interesting, like you said, who gets preference to kind of tell these stories. And Kim Burns, you're right, is everywhere. Probably the one documentarian most people know if you ask them.
Right. And, the film that I made before this chronicles two labor events in Texas history, both of them victories. And I know that nobody's heard of one of them, which is Annie Mae Carpenter is not going to ring a bell in Nacogdoches for anybody. She was an African-American woman at Stephen F. Austin State University who refused to clean the men's dormitory bathrooms and got fired. And then it became a massive uprising in Nacogdoches with 3,000 people marching through in the late 80s. It's an incredible story that nobody knows. The other one is Emma Tenayuka, who's on all of these murals. But again, this is a walkout in San Antonio in the 30s of 10,000 pecan shellers, many of them undocumented, all of them young, old, women, and they walked out. And they also won their strike. So again, history, people may know Emma Tenayuka's name, but certainly not that history, which is really, really important Texas history.
At the beginning of the film, we see an interview with a former miner who kind of talks about the mining company, them cautioning him to protect this mule that's being used for the job because of the monetary value of the mule. Then had no real response when he asked the question, well, what about me? And the fact that he learned very quickly, right, that they preference the life of the mule over his own life. So how do you think this scene and the information in it serve as a sort of thesis for what Barbara Kopple wants us to learn about what she shows us or depicts for us in Harlan County, USA?
That's just a crucial point. The former miner is Nimrod Workman, who would have celebrated his, I think, 100th birthday fairly recently. So I've just been thinking about him. He won a National Heritage Award for his singing. I believe he's mainly Native American from West Virginia. Chattaroy, West Virginia was his home. He was just a wonderful, wonderful man, just full of life and spirit and connected to all of the progressive movements in that area. So when he tells that story, it's a kind of a classic story. But again, it's this question of devaluing people. You can see people spending more money on a piece of machinery than on human beings now, or caring more about their piece of machinery than they cared about the human being that was running it because the human being was cheaper, I think it's a common feeling among workers still, not just in the mines, but I forgot to mention when I was introducing myself, I'm still very active in labor unions, so this question of individual workers having absolutely no power to affect change and needing to in some way create solidarity with each other, I think is critical. I think it informs the whole piece. I think it's a wonderful analogy. It seems a little remote in a way because we don't think of working mules underground, but right. I feel for the mule too.
Yeah, you're right. And on one hand, pretty funny story, the way that he tells it, right? And you start thinking like, oh man, what are we in for? And I watched it again last night and I've seen it multiple times and it just still hits me every time that like, this is not going to be an easy story. I mean, based on that story that he tells, even though he tells it very humorously. One of my favorite people in this film is Lois Scott, who organized the women in helping their husbands and their sons and brothers and friends secure union contracts. Probably a bit of an aside for some people, but I caught it. And she says very quickly to let your conscience be your guide. Then she says right after that, I never run.
Right.
How do you think that represents the overall theme of the narrative and what you all were up against as crew members making this film?
The people were amazing, and Lois was certainly amazing. She was not a miner's wife. She did not live in Brookside. She lived in the neighboring town. Her daughter has some very explicit language for Basil Collins at one point, which I just felt like, oh, I'm going to die right here on the spot, but she was saying some things to him very directly. So Lois was coming over in support. Lois was, is a big woman, tough woman who was always involved. She was involved in everything in her community. She was the person that went to the PTA and decided, man, this isn't really representing kids. I'm going to take it over. She was involved in everything, and she was strong and righteous. And, when she says, let your conscience be your guide, I know this is peace and conflict, but she wasn't always the most peaceful person in the world. Although I never saw her actually commit an act of violence. Honestly, I never did. She wasn't afraid of violence. She would confront it. And she said that after this very dramatic scene in the movie, but in real life too, earlier that day, where everybody on the picket line was attacked, physically attacked. And so she was like, we got to defend ourselves because nobody else was going to defend us. So it was a statement of self-defense.
Speaking of that attack, another question I wanted to ask you about, one of the most chilling scenes in this movie is that shot of Basil Collins in that truck pointing that gun at you all and at you. Yes. At you.
At me.
Yes, absolutely. And and then the assault takes place on you all. Barbara talks about being kicked and swinging her bike and trying to fend them off. I was going to ask you to speak to that moment a little bit for us. Aside from the events that were happening, kind of like what provoked him at that moment for them to do that? Because they were already riled up, but at that moment to attack you all like that.
Well, should I tell the whole story?
Yes, please.
I saw it. So this is something that happens very early in the morning because shift change was very early in the morning. So this is when the strikebreakers or scabs would come through the picket line to work in the mine where all the regular workers were on strike. It was a moment always of great tension. Like I said, I was pretty young. I think I was 24 or 25 at the time. And one of my jobs was to hold the lights. And we have these lights called sun guns. And they're very high intensity lights. And the DP positioned me at the edge of this bridge leading over in a way where I was basically blinding Basil Collins. So I'm holding these lights up above my head like that. And Basil Collins can't see behind me. And I realize it right at that moment. He's not pointing a gun at me at all, really. He's just worried that he's being ambushed. So he pulls out a gun, and it was very close to me physically. I'm basically doing isometrics, trying to get these lights away from my head, because I know that that's what he's angry about. And I think maybe he'll just shoot the lights out and everything will be okay. But it was like one of those moments of suddenly being conscious of what's going on in a very slow, methodical way. And then they all go across the bridge. And that morning, rather than just going to work, they all got clubs and stuff, and they came back across the bridge at us. And they hit not me, but the lights. So everything's now happening in the dark. And it's terrifying. In the film, you hear these screams. And what was going on was Bill Worthington, who was African American and on the picket line and very deeply involved in something called the Black Lung Association, which was about occupational disease, had a young intern, a woman that was going to be a lawyer. And Bill had his gun out and Basil Collins had his gun out, and they were walking down the highway together with guns pointed at each other. And she honestly had no idea what to do. So she began just screaming at the top of her lungs. And that's what you're hearing. It sounds like somebody is being hurt, but in fact, she's just terrified. And then there were people hurt. There were people hit over the head with those pipes and stuff. We, as a film crew, were not particularly hurt. The sun guns were damaged, but as you can tell, the camera was okay, and we were okay. And Barbara did swing her microphone at these guys. And eventually, they just decided that enough was enough, and you can hear all these lead pipes and stuff dropping to the ground, and Basil motions them across the bridge, and they just all went across the bridge again. That was that day. It was a very intense experience, and it's what produces the next day, which was this picket line that was very interesting, where my cameo is, because I got very huffy and indignant and filed a warrant on Basil Collins, went down to the city and filed a warrant and said, this guy shoved a gun in my face. So that's why the whole confrontation with the sheriff the
With the
next day
sheriff. Oh,
is
wow.
about. That's why I filed the warrant. And then I ended up getting arrested for willfully attempting to block a public highway, which is, a felony in retribution. I got hauled down and fingerprinted, and all of it was dropped when the strike was won.
That scene, it just always sticks with me because I think it's the way that it's shot. It seems like slow motion when he's driving by and pointing
It
at
is.
it
It
is,
is.
yeah. And
It
it's
is
just
in slow motion. It's exactly the way it felt at the time for me.
I can
Yeah.
imagine. It just kind of speaks to, like, again, just so much about what you all were up against as not only them on the picket line, but you all as crew members there with them trying to chronicle this story. And it just, man, that's a great story to hear. I mean, not at the time, I'm sure, but it's great to hear you relay it for sure.
Well, it all came out okay, right?
Yeah, it did. It all came out good. It did. You mentioned Bill Worthington, but more so, I wanted to ask about race relations in this struggle, actually. I mean, there are a few instances in the film where we see some Black miners there, and in particular, when Basil Collins calls one of them the N-word. And I think it's Lois, maybe, that hollers back, he's a better man than you'll ever be. What did you notice about race relations when you were shooting?
Eastern Kentucky, that part of Eastern Kentucky is about 99% white. What's interesting is at a certain point, a third of the workforce in the coal mines was African American. There's a history of African Americans in those mining areas, and it's a very strong history. And the Mine Workers Union was one of the few unions that actually did not have segregated locals. So you can see pictures of Black miners and white miners together. And it's not that there wasn't racism. There was plenty of racism. But the big joke was, well, we all look the same anyway after the shift. So in fact, there was, particularly from the mine owners, but also a certain amount from the union, there was racism involved. Black miners got worse jobs, at least until the union came in. When the union came in, it was really a force for much less racism in the workforce. So the union was a really powerful anti-racist force in the mines. And there were still, at that time, towns or areas of coal camps that were Black. The coal camps' housing was very segregated. It wasn't just Black, white, but it was also, some places had Eastern European, had Czech miners or Hungarian miners, and they were all in their little parts of the camp, and it was illegal to go from one part of the camp to another because they really wanted to use those divisions to keep the workforce from unionizing. And Black miners actually were brought in from northern Alabama, Birmingham area as well, to break strikes. A lot of them ended up joining the unions. And you can see, particularly in West Virginia, Black leadership in locals that were mixed race.
That's something also that from another time I saw that John Sayles, the great John Sayles, in Magwan, his movie Magwan depicts that happening, what you're describing. It's so funny how that was the case. I'd like to say he's chronicling something that happened way earlier than what you're describing, but it's the same practice.
It really was true all the way up through the 50s. And then the union was broken. And there's something called the East Kentucky Social Club, which is really cool. And what it is all of these people were basically forced out because they were the last hired. And so they went to major cities. They went to LA, they went to New York, they went to Boston. And the East Kentucky Social Club is this gathering of people from Lynch, Kentucky or Benham, Kentucky, these little coal camps in Kentucky. Then they get together in these major cities. And what's also interesting is how very well a lot of those people have done.
I didn't know any of that.
I mean, there's also Klan stuff in Eastern Kentucky, and Eastern Kentucky is now very reactionary. It's changed even since I left there. At the time of Harlan County U.S.A., there were still Black communities throughout that area. And so those Black miners were coming, I think from Benham probably, over to the picket line to support miners. And then Bill Worthington was somebody who'd lived in Harlan County forever, had worked in the mines, had become a great grassroots leader in this fight about occupational health and safety. and a
Yeah.
well respected member of the community.
Man. So now I got to read up on all of this afterwards. 'Cause this is amazing. It's
Yeah, there's
amazing.
some great scholars. I'll send you their
No,
books.
please.
I'll send you some info about
I
that.
would love to. That's amazing. This is incredible. Wow. Could you talk a little more about the role of the women in this fight for the union contracts and how influential were they in terms of being able to help these men achieve these union contracts, particularly given some of the patriarchal attitudes that were prevalent at the time? Like I think about the scene I was talking about. We're surprised to see our women out here
Yeah.
acting like this. And I was like, what? But yeah.
I don't know if you all have seen the film Salt of the Earth.
We did it for one of our screenings this
Oh,
year.
wonderful. One of the reasons I think that the women created an auxiliary, I still have a jacket somewhere, was a women's auxiliary from Brookside. But the miners' wives created an auxiliary was because we brought that film and showed it, and people just kind of picked up on it. But women were very involved from the beginning. So what happened was they created injunctions on who could be on picket lines. So you could only have 3 of the miners on picket lines. And so what happened was they couldn't form injunctions against women being on the picket line because they didn't work in the mines at that time. Later on, there was a real movement for women to get into coal mines. But at that time, there weren't any women in that mine particularly. So they came out to form the picket line because it was illegal for men to be on the picket line. So then you begin seeing the strength of women defending really community values. The union is a lot more than, getting a pay raise or something like that. It directly impacts the health of the community, impacts health and safety. So the union fight became a fight of everyone, not just the working miners. So they were out and they were incredibly powerful and is very important in the film. The other thing is things change in editing a lot, and actually men did play a pretty strong role in the strike as well. I mean, they were not stepping to the background while women did all the work. They were definitely out there too and doing a lot of things.
Those women, like I say, are just incredible and breathe so much energy, I feel, into this film. I particularly like the scene, the women kind of get into it with each other and talk about who's sleeping with whose husband. And they have that moment where that happens to them. And then Sudi Castleberry.
Yes, Sudi Crusenberry.
Crusenberry, yeah, if somebody runs off with my man, fine, I don't care. I'm here about the union contract. But then she tells this really poignant story about not being as educated as she would have liked. What was she like? I know we talked a lot about
It's wonderful. I mean, they all were, even the people that were on the wrong side in that little argument. Frida Noe is one of the women that's really being catty. And she was a wonderful union woman, too. The older woman there would cook for us all the time. They were an amazing community of people. Sudi was just absolutely great. And I love that scene is in there because it's so authentic, because it shows that people can resolve differences. Because the next day, everybody was out there on the picket line together. Right. Maybe you need to have a little conflict and a little struggle and call each other names occasionally. Maybe it's necessary, but it just makes things very authentic for me because that's really what it's like, right? Even among friends, there are times when you bicker, right?
You're right. They do. They resolve that issue. It doesn't last very long. They get past it because they get back to the heart of what's important.
It would be a great film to show for conflict resolution because it is the way that conflict sometimes gets resolved is by somebody who's been in the background coming to the foreground and saying, wait a moment, y'all.
It was amazing watching that occur.
It's interesting for me because it's similar to what happens with a preacher after Lawrence Jones is killed, which is another scene where you watch conflict be resolved, which is unusual, I think. On an internal level, it is about how do you resolve conflict, not just between workers and a company, but also how do you maintain solidarity? How do you resolve conflict within your own group?
Yeah.
Which is really much harder in a lot of ways. It demands more of you, or maybe you just never do resolve those bigger societal conflicts, but you have to resolve the conflicts within your group.
I love that scene, like you mentioned with the preacher, when he gets up there and he says, if there was any time to calm yourself down, this would be the time to do it. And
Hold your peace.
yes,
Hold your peace.
hold your
Yeah.
peace. He said, this would be the time to hold it. Because I was going to ask you to speak a little bit about Lawrence Jones's murder. You know, he was 23, 24, and he had the 16-year-old wife and child, and then he's murdered on the line. And I remember the preacher also saying, I wish it had been me. I'm on my way out anyway. You know, I've lived my life, and to take somebody this young. I thought that particularly Lawrence dying for what he believed in, and his mother, we see that scene of her passing out at his funeral, but she's saying before that, I wanted all my children to be Union men, like very proud of what he had done. Could you talk a little bit about the events that surrounded Lawrence's murder?
Well, I think it's complex. I don't think people go out to die for a union, or any other thing. They're willing to take chances, but I don't think people go out for that reason. I think in this situation, there were multiple reasons why that happened. I went back and kind of tried to figure out what had happened. I went to the grand jury, and Bill Bruner, who had shot Lawrence Jones, was not charged because there was gunfire back and forth. I think that it's, again, quite complex. But I think what's really interesting is what then happens. What in fact happened, which is not really in the film, if you ask how they won, you would say they won by sticking it out. And that would be true and important and probably the right answer. But at that point, the US government intervened on the side of the miners, because at that time, the coal industry was much more organized. There was a national contract coming up, and the country's very dependent on coal. I mean, people are fighting here in Austin to get the Fayette coal plant closed. It's like when you turn on your light, it's got a certain component of coal going in there. So this is really core stuff. And these guys that seem remote and seem like, oh, why should anybody care about them, are in fact at the core of what's running our economy, at that time. It was very important that it not turn into a major battle, because every coal miner in the country would have walked out if they hadn't gotten a contract. So you have this little thing in this remote part of the country becoming very, very important to the entire economy of the country, which shows you the potential power of working people, right?
Right. Wow. Yeah. It reminds me of that scene when they go to New York and they're on Wall Street. I think it's Jerry Johnson.
Jerry Johnson,
Yeah, that talks to the police officer. And that's such a great conversation. I'm glad that's in the film too, right? And Jerry kind of points out all these lights here. People don't realize how that's because of what we do, and how that distinction between how much people don't know how reliant we are on what these miners are doing.
The behind the scenes on that one is the cop didn't realize the conversation was being recorded, I don't think, because there was no visible microphone. The camera was there, but cameras weren't attached to microphones in those days. And Jerry had a little hidden microphone under his placard. And so he's like, if you look at the footage and know that, you can see him trying to hold, the wind's blowing it, and he's trying to keep the microphone hidden. Just this wonderful, funny conversation about medical benefits.
Yeah. He goes, yeah, I get dental. Jerry's like, you get dental? He's like, man, I hope this doesn't sound shallow, but I found myself this go around watching the film, paying attention to their health and looking at their teeth, things like that. Those needs were not being met for them. And so when Jerry hears that he has dental, and Jerry kind of goes, what?
Like, yeah. And the cop says, yeah, I got drugs.
And he's like, what?
It's just a spoof on that poor cop.
And then the fact, too, that he even asked, like, oh, I thought this was y'all's first day out here. Jerry's like, no, this is 9 months.
Yeah.
We've been fighting for this.
Yeah. And the cop says, yeah, that's great. I'm so glad you're up here getting attention to it.
Yeah, he's like, what did I say about that? Yeah, you're right. It's funny, too, but it's such a great scene because it just shows how most of us as citizens are so unaware of these basic things that we take for granted, like what it really takes to get those things. I want to tell you a little bit about the music in the film. Of course, you get that great scene with Florence Reece setting up which side are you on, and then Hazel Dickens, of course, is a lot of the music here. The music to me seems to be like another character in this film. How important do you feel like these protest songs were, not only kind of enhancing the film's narrative, but as an influence on the struggle around unionizing?
Well, again, there's this wonderful history of song and movement. And it's true in the labor movement with all the wobbly songs. And there's just a wealth of music that we don't know very well. Billy Bragg does it kind of punk style. It's fun. But this is very authentic mountain music, sung very much the way it was sung all along by Hazel, who's from West Virginia and lived in Baltimore, went to work in factories, and then became a singer-songwriter. But she's writing about the explosion at the Mannington mine. She's writing about black lung, and she's writing about it from somebody whose brother has black lung or father dies of black lung, that kind of relationship. Florence Reece was still living in East Tennessee at that time. So she was living an hour and a half away from Harlan County. So it's very easy to get her to the rally. I think Bill Worthington sings This Little Light of Mine at one of the rallies. There was a lot of music, but I think that's true of the civil rights movement. You know, any of these really wonderful movements. It's even true of the anti-Vietnam War movement. Some of the stuff that we think of as kind of 60s psychedelic music was also protest music. Certainly Bob Dylan's stuff is all very much protest music. So I think that just kind of comes with the turf, that when people are trying to create solidarity and create community and create some courage, singing a song together really works pretty well.
I was listening to them this time, as I do when I watch this movie, and the storytelling in them are amazing. They're relaying this history and giving you this information in addition to rallying the troops, if you will. It does so much. And I think part of the charm of it also, too, is the voices aren't polished. It's so heartfelt and so real, absolutely real.
Yeah, it's great stuff. And Hazel was a wonderful, wonderful woman. So was Florence Reece, but I knew Hazel better than I knew Florence Reece.
Man, it's amazing you knew all these people. I mean,
yeah, it's really cool, actually.
Very cool. It is. On the Criterion channel, the stuff for Harlan County, John Sayles talks about it for a while, and he mentions hearing Hazel Dickens in the movie, like, who is that? And then getting her for Matewan. Which is terrific. I really like Matewan. It's a great film. If y'all haven't seen Matewan, see Matewan.
But it won't leave you happy.
No, it will not.
Harlan County leaves you kind of happy, at least.
I agree.
I saw Matewan in a union hall. This organizer at the end of film said, now don't that just make you feel grand?
Because it does not end nice.
It makes you just want to go out and organize. And he was saying it very sarcastically. But
you're right about that. Harlan County does, despite the heaviness of its subject matter, it does end on a bright note. There is a hopeful note at the end of it, which is good. Yeah, Matewan will not do that. Over the years, how much do you think that Harlan County, USA has helped influence union organization or brought awareness to similar plights concerning the working class?
You know, I think it's really important. I can't think of other films about labor. There's some really good labor films out there, by the way. But this one, everybody looks at in the labor movement at some point or other, just about everybody. You know, it's used a lot to examine strategy and tactics and stuff like that. It's been important within the labor movement, but I'm very curious about it because I think when we were working on it, we never thought that it was going to become anything much. I mean, it was going to be a film and it was going to be a good film, but that's usually as far as you go on anything. Right. At least that's as far as I go. So it's been very interesting. And I asked a film studies class once about why on earth this very remote, really not very important, whether the Brookside strike was won or lost doesn't really matter. In the broad scheme of things, you know, it's a very minor thing in a very remote place with people that have been stereotyped, actually, rather than admired. And yet it's captured all of this attention. I am somewhat mystified by it, to be honest.
Really? Why?
Well, I don't understand it. I think it's a very good film. It's unique in that it's the exception that proves the rule.
Wow. I thought about, even in the fact in watching it, it's clearly taking place in the 70s, but it just still, it's so impactful. And those issues that are brought up in that film are interestingly still relevant, shouldn't be, unfortunately, right?
Right.
Still relevant in so many ways that we're still not treating working class people any better in this country.
I made a film about fast food workers in
Mm.
Eastern Kentucky in the early 90s, and actually it just played in Tennessee again. It was like it could be tomorrow morning, in terms of pay levels and the need to unionize. I find it very interesting that the film did so well.
And continues to resonate like it does. I mean, y'all won the Oscar for your efforts. I love watching Barbara talking about how happy they were in Harlan County about the fact we won, and they were very happy about that.
Well, that's not quite true.
Can you tell
No,
us
people
what
were
is true?
deeply, a lot of people were embarrassed by the film in Harlan County.
Really, why?
Well, it was pretty intimate. It exposes their poverty. If they weren't involved in the strike, which most people weren't, would you be proud of not being involved?
Oh,
Seriously, there were people that were very unhappy with the film. I think Barbara didn't live there, and I did. So I saw it probably for the next 25 years. I had some sense of it. People in the region, a lot of people didn't even know about it, never saw it. I worked for a group in Eastern Kentucky called Apple Shop, which made a whole bunch of really great films. And they were in Whitesburg, Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, which is the next county over from Harlan County. It was mainly people working there that grew up in the mountains. It was very interesting when I began working, a lot of pieces that were cultural, and then a piece about the Buffalo Creek flood and some other really fine work. And local people hadn't seen it. So my second job with Apple Shop was trying to get stuff on local television so that local people could see it. Because how do you see a 16 millimeter film in a movie theater? At that time, there weren't even VHS tapes floating around, right? Harlan County wasn't on public television until maybe 10 years ago or something like that. It was ridiculous. It was not allowed to be on public television. The film was really only seen in theaters at that time. It was not on television. There weren't any movie theaters except drive-ins, It didn't play in any of the drive-ins, or any of the theaters in Eastern Kentucky. So local people didn't see it.
wow.
Except I think Barbara brought it down to the community center in Everett and had one screening, but one screening is not going to, that much of a remote territory. And I think probably, there's a real class base there. I don't think a lot of universities would have shown it at that time. There weren't any universities. There were occasional community colleges.
But that would show, wow. I did not know that it had been just that recent that public television had broadcast this film.
I mean, I might be wrong. It might be 20 years, but I think there was at least a 20-year period after that film came out where it was never shown on television.
And I didn't even think about it like that, like how people would have reacted negatively to that, right? Because it does show some very impoverished conditions. Let me ask you this from my limited knowledge about unions and mining communities and such. Was it the same in Harlan County where kind of everything was done in-house with the mines, like they owned everything?
Yes. There were welfare camps that were even worse than coal camps. There was a pattern of ownership that was really very strongly coal company ownership. And in this case, an absentee owner. I mean, it was Duke Power. It was very controlling of people's lives. You went to the company doctor, you went to the company school. Some of the coal camps were pretty fancy. I mean, you had opera houses in some of them. They were trying to educate the workforce, some of them, but a lot of them were not.
And no indoor plumbing, as the movie depicts in so many of those places. The living conditions are just terrible. If I can just refer back to Maywan, I mean, he's depicting some of these same things.
Right.
Nothing has changed. Why do you think the change has been so slow?
I think there were major changes when the union began, which was 30s. For one thing, there was national policy with Roosevelt and the NRA, and there was a support for union organizing, and there were very powerful unions. And you have the whole building of the CIO and very strong labor movement. That continues through World War II. And then in the 50s, there's this concerted effort, particularly in the South, to bust labor unions. You have Taft-Hartley coming in at the end of the Second World War. And then you have attempt to revitalize the economy based on super exploitation of workers. And that's true in Texas, certainly. So you have, I think it's somewhere around 4% of eligible workers are unionized in Texas. That's pitiful. That includes public sector.
Man.
And the reason is, well, I know for state workers, there's no collective bargaining. It's illegal to have collective bargaining in Texas if you're a state worker. So there are no contracts for state workers. So policemen, firemen have contracts because they're city workers. But all the people that work downtown and at Health and Human Services or the School for the Blind or the School for the Deaf or UT Austin or any of those places do not have contracts.
So they're just at will, basically.
We're all at will.
Well, I'm always suspicious when people are anti-union. I'm like, why? Why are you anti-union?
Well, there's been a lot of criticism of unions, and of course, there's always some truth in a stereotype, right? But the fact of the matter is, given the choice between non-union and union, it's a kind of a no-brainer. It's kind of at the base of what you do.
So insightful to think about that, for sure. I have one more question to ask you, but I want to open the door. We do have a union, but I guess we can limit how we can work. Yeah, I think it is very limited. I know, for example, when I used to teach public school, there is a union, Education Austin, but it's very limited. And there was some rumblings about the fact that they were too closely connected to the school district. So teachers really kind of felt like they didn't have any recourse either.
Yeah, except, it's a pretty amazing story lately, because what's happened with Education Austin is they've now got the majority of the school board is all former teachers and union members. Mm-hmm. So we're going to have a decent superintendent, I think, for the first time in a long time. Really exciting.
It's great. Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to open the floor to questions from our audience. We have one already here with Shirin. So go ahead.
I wonder how many people know that the University of California system, graduate students who are employed by the university system are on strike. 48,000 graduate students is the largest strike in American higher education history. And it's all because they are allowed to be unionized. They're part of the UAW, United Auto Workers Union.
Whoa.
They have quit teaching. They have quit doing their research. When you have classes that are 200 plus, there are multiple graduate students who are doing the grading, who are doing basically all the work.
I remember that.
Yeah, so they are on strike. They have quit this week. They're picketing every day.
Yeah, it's really exciting. We have the right to organize, and we do organize. We just don't have contracts. So it's kind of back to 30s style organizing, where you can't say to people, well, we will protect you if you join the union. We can say we'll fight for higher wages, but we're fighting with the Texas legislature. That's really fun. Particularly right now, it's pretty sad.
That's a battle. Aqua?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to circle back to a point. I think it was Anne who made it. Why is it that you think that the number of unionized workers in Texas is only 4%? That just seems like laughably low.
One of the things that they grew the economy in the U.S. South. First of all, there are all kinds of workers, like migrant workers are unprotected by any kind of labor law in this country. There's a little bit of labor law that kind of applies. So there was a certain amount of racism involved, to be honest, about how labor law was created in this country to begin with. In the late 40s, when unions were pretty powerful, there was an act passed called the Taft-Hartley Act. What it did was it said that it limited the ability of workers to get together across work sites. And it also is the beginning of what's called the right to work law, which means that if you vote to have a union in a workplace, it doesn't mean that everybody's a member of the union. People have the choice about whether to join or not join. It's all touted as right to work, and all of that nonsense. But the fact is, it's a repressive anti-union situation. And those laws were passed throughout the South. And the idea was to develop the economy on the basis of really lousy, no unions. So companies all fled South. Now they've gone really South, right? You could see auto workers. The biggest place for US auto now is not Detroit. It's like Northern Alabama. There's this movement of industry down towards the South. That's why Texas has very low unemployment rates, because we're producing all this stuff down here because we have lousy workman's comp. We have lousy unemployment compensation. We have lousy health and safety. We have lousy wages, and the lack of organization. Without a demand, nothing happens, right? So the lack of organization means that those things happen. But that was the basis on which industry was recruited. It makes sense. I mean, employers will fight like the Dickens against it. I'm part of the Labor Council in Austin, and even getting Tesla to meet minimal OSHA standards is like huge. Things that should be automatic are a real battle here.
Wow. Okay, thank you.
The people that are organized are great. I mean, they're wonderful people, and it's kind of like Harlan County. Those people that stand up are the people that you want to be part of and you want to admire.
Layla?
I have a couple questions. I'm going to just ask one, and then if there's time, I'll raise my hand again. One of them that I'm curious about is if you could speak to, this was a really long strike. It was 13 months. It's a really long time for people to be without an income. And I was wondering if you could speak to how the community sustained itself and what maybe type of mutual aid efforts were integral to being able to hold out for as long as they did, which you said was pretty essential to victory.
One thing that happened quite a bit, there was a strike fund from the union. People did get a certain amount of money. It wasn't as much as their wages had been, but they did have some money coming in. And the wages were awful at the point when they went on strike. It wasn't like there was a huge amount to lose. Family structure, at least at that time in Appalachia, was pretty strong. And so people, a lot of them lived in extended families. There was the coal camp life, but there were also people that lived outside of town. You saw the structure in Matewan, where local people might very well have their own land, or their grandparents might have their own land. And so there was a lot of family structural support, multi-generational support. A lot of the older miners who were drawing pensions, for example, and Social Security. So there was a fair amount of those kinds of programs still functioning. This is also not very long after the War on Poverty, which centered in Appalachia. So there very well could be family members that had gone into trades, that had gone out of the region and were sending money home. It's not as isolated as even I have made it out to be, There were a lot of people that headed for Detroit for auto plants and stuff when mining was being mechanized, and those family members would send money to support families. So there was quite an intact family structure. There was also a community structure, and everybody had a garden. Just basic survival skills were still very intact in that area, and people did share what they grew, but everybody was growing stuff during the summer and canning stuff. It's an incredible part of the country. It's this kind of industrial in terms of communities and towns and stuff, but it's also very rural. Survival skills still exist there. One funny story about that. I had lived other places, but Barbara was from New York. We were kind of city people, and we went down there and we didn't really know very much at all. We were pretty scared, actually. We'd sit down and people would be gracious and they'd give us food and they'd give us coffee, always coffee. And then, the conversation would kind of come to a halt, and we'd get up to leave. We'd say, thank you so much, goodbye. And they'd say, don't rush off. And we'd sit down again. And this would go on. And finally, we realized that don't rush off meant goodbye, right? But there was a kind of a graciousness and a politeness that's just totally against the stereotype of what hillbillies are or something, of just really welcoming you and not saying anything unkind. And, it was a very good culture. in a lot of ways. Damaged, but good.
That sounds like my grandparents saying things like, oh, don't rush off. And you're like, yeah, I'm gonna head on out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Layla, go ahead and ask your second question.
It's less directly about this film. When you mentioned the government's intervention on the side of the miners, it made me think about the potential for an impending railway strike with the railroad union workers. And the government's already been articulating like, well, this would be very bad for our economy, which is already struggling. And it sounded as though you felt that the role of the government was fairly favorable. Obviously, the miners, they did get the contract, but it was still limited in terms of allowing them to strike locally in the face of future grievance. Looking at the railroad workers strike or the negotiations over a new contract, do you think that the government will play a similar role in favor of the railroad workers in this contemporary situation?
I mean, they're going to intervene, I believe. The government will intervene, and that will be seen as negative on the part of the government. But at the same time, the workers may benefit from that. I think energy should be nationalized. I don't think we should have private people controlling things like railroads or coal mines or anything like that, which is, I guess, a somewhat radical viewpoint, but a fairly rational viewpoint. So coal miners went on strike during the Second World War. And you can imagine how the response to that one, which was immediate. You need coal to build bombs and everything, right? And we're in the middle of the Second World War. And John L. Lewis, who's the head of the mine workers union at that time, said that more American men had died in the coal mines in the first year of the war than had died fighting. And he pulled them out on strike. You know, the government immediately came in and took control of the mines. And in fact, what they got out of it, among other things, was a really good health insurance and pension fund. So the mine workers really gained from that strike. And the same thing could happen with the rail workers. It might look like, oh, no, the government is intervening because of business, you know, and therefore they're intervening on the side of companies. But in fact, what could happen is we all need more money on our paychecks, but this is a very important strike and a very legitimate strike for rail workers. Honestly, they might really come out better if the government does intervene. I'm not saying that I think Biden is the most wonderful president we've ever had or anything, but the fact of the matter is he does have some sense of blue-collar work. The people that he's got working in the Labor Department are very good, like a world of difference between him and the former president. The Biden administration is actually supporting independent union efforts in Mexico, which is incredible in terms of observation and making sure that things are right.
Interesting.
It is. It really is. I had no idea.
I'm optimistic right now.
That's good. I feel like the police officer in the movie, like, what? Really?
I know, because we're brought up to distrust the government, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the government does the right thing.
Sometimes. Right. Well, the last question I'd like to ask to kind of end on a fun note, I guess. In the making of Harlan County documentary that's on the Criterion Challenge I've talked about, you mentioned that the film kind of takes place at the height of the women's lib movement. There's a scene in the film, those of you who haven't seen it, where Lois Scott takes this gun out of her bra. You made the comment that you don't know which act was more liberating, taking the gun out of the bra or burning your bra.
Yeah.
So have you come to a decision about which one you think is more liberating?
Hopefully neither one. They're both somewhat symbolic gestures, but is that a good enough answer? I think
that'd be good. Yes, it is. They're both symbolic gestures. I was really worried about Lois, the way she was taking that gun out of her bra. I was like, Lois, that's upside down.
It's trigger finger, yeah.
She was like, just, yeah, look at, you got Lois seemed to me like she knew exactly how to handle a gun if she needed to.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, for sure. I'm going to turn this back over to Shirin.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to watch the movie again. The insights you share, the context will make it even more enjoyable the second time around. Got a lot out of it. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your evening with us. I think this is our last film of the semester, but we have more coming in the spring semester. Please join us. And thank you so much, Really
Yes.
appreciate your time. And this was a fun conversation too.
It was.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Absolutely. Thank y'all.